So let's get started. You still have an opportunity, and my colleague put the link into the chat to answer to the Mentimeter. So it's just 2 questions, and we will turn to these questions later after Richèl's talk to see what you think on your motivations, challenges, and of course we might talk a little bit about what are ways forward, solutions from the community or libraries or infrastructures or whatever, and what challenges might stay with us for a while. Yeah, anyway, so let's move on. I mean, we have as a setting of this webinar, we run this with as 2 alliances. So university alliances have been created since a couple of years. There's more than 40 and more to come because the Commission still offers these fundings. And this webinar is actually from 2 satellites projects. So there is research and innovation projects related to these Erasmus based alliances. ENLIGHT is one where 10 universities, and Arqus is the other one. So you can see the bunch of universities involved here, and we have open science research infrastructure, research and innovation, other topics like impact and so on embedded in these projects. So I hope you will enjoy this webinar, and if you have any suggestions, wishes for further topics, or we had one on opportunities and challenges around practicing open science. It was based on a survey done in Arqus. So it was our first webinar today with Richèl on pros and cons, and one to come on open source software licensing in April. And yeah, you're welcome if you want to speak, or if you have any ideas for topics, please get in touch with us, and we are happy to organize more of these. And I hope this will be a lively session. And yeah, so I hand over to Richèl now. He's a biologist based at University of Uppsala. And yeah, we were in touch in the past through a call we had on some award thing. And yeah, so
yeah, thanks so much.
take it away.
So for my talk, will take 25 minutes. I've clocked this. But please always interrupt if you want to. We know that afterwards is a discussion, but please just yell. I prefer really yelling because that's very clear signal. You can all yell all the time. We always finish on time anyways. Yeah, so please do that. You can use the chat. I know that Merle and the others, they will check the chat for you if you don't like yelling, but please yell and interrupt me. I won't be unhappy about that. So my talk is called Open Science, and I may have modified the title a bit. You can all see my screen, I assume. If not, I expect you to yell, for example. The title of this talk is called Open Science, and it will be the pros, the cons, and its community. My name, this is how you pronounce it, Richèl, rhymes on seashell, that's how I remember it. And this presentation, you can already download it here, but I know that Merle does all these fancy open data things. That's all great. I'm happy not to do that, admin, but you can also find it here. This presentation is in the public domain because I care more about open science than getting this glory from attributing me all the time. Just use everything you find here ruthlessly, and I don't care about you naming me. The goals of my talk is to discuss open science. That's what we're all here for. And I want to share you the usefulness of a community, and I will convince you by some kind of little experiment you'll see. I need to talk a bit what I do, so you know a bit where I'm coming from. So I have been in academia. I've nearly done 2 postdocs. I quit the second one. Now I'm support staff in Uppsala University in Sweden, so I help scientists use our computer clusters we have here. And I'm also a founder of the community in Uppsala for open science called Open Science Uppsala. It's a bit of a dull name, but it's very clear what it does. There are more communities there in Uppsala, but we are the most visible for sure. And you can find my work on GitHub. This is where I hang out a lot, where I share open source software, open teaching material, open papers. You can find everything there. I do a lot of things in the open. Now you know where I'm coming from. This talk has 3 type of experiments. I'll be talking about first the cons of open science. I've been doing you'll see. I'll talk about the pros of open science, and I'll talk about the community. And I'll use 3 variable names if you want to use the term. And I want to ask you, if you have the time, could you just for yourself feel how much you enjoy each part of the talk? Just internally, I won't ask you what you think, but it will help you convince, it will help you determine if I've met the goals of this talk. You'll see it's a bit informal mathematical here. So the first part of this talk, it's called More Literature. It's I wanted to do a literature search, and I've done that, to the biggest drawbacks of open science for a researcher today, because I feel we should always be critical also on things we enjoy a lot. So what I did, I searched the literature for 5 hours, which is the same time I spent in the local community in Uppsala about open science. So that's the same amount of time I put in there. And from the literature search, I collected all the results I got in that limited amount of time. I'm not an open science scientist per se. I'm interested, and I do some searching in my free time for this. From those results, I ranked these. This is highly personal. I will show you all of them, but very shortly. For example, the result of this, what I found, these are, I think, are the least relevant. These are maybe relevant. And these are reference to literature, I think, are the most relevant if you look for criticism on open science. Well, in this presentation, you see that there are nice like footnotes to the literature. Everywhere you can download the presentation if you really want to find out those references. And what is already very clear is that there's a paper 2 is very commonly, because it does exactly the same thing. It researches the pros and cons of open science. So it's very reasonable. You see that paper multiple times. And what are the cons or the problems or the challenges of open science according to the literature is that, for example, open data excludes or inconveniences the industry. That's a thing that I found again. And this smiley here means that I already knew this before I did that, because I have been to the open science community in Uppsala. There was someone that spoke about this, and I'll even share you that talk. I found out that there's a lack of standards for sharing research material. This is probably being worked on. This is being worked on. I know that because I went to the open science community in Uppsala. The open infrastructure is not in place yet, according to 2 papers. I guess that depends per field, but I already knew this because at our local community, we discussed this by someone that worked on that. I found that open data, especially making it fair, so findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, takes more time. Well, sure, super obvious. I already knew that because people worked on that. What I find new, but was not discussed in my local community, is that sharing sensitive data is more complex. Well, I've not seen a talk about this yet, but I do feel this is true. I really felt that open methods, they take a bit more time, yeah, because you are forced to do more things. There are some references to literature in this talk too. And the most interesting thing I found is that open data has no clear legal guidelines nor sanctions. And what is meant by this paper is that if I, for example, publish some data and I want to not make it open today, but I put an embargo on it for 2 years, then after 2 years, I should make it public. That's what I promised. But I can easily don't do that and don't care and keep it secret anyways. There are no sanctions for this. That's the claim of the paper. So I never thought about this. So this is a thing I learned by this literature search. This is the most interesting thing I found from the literature search. So this is part 1. My second experiment. Oh, and I encourage you to think, well, how interesting do you think this part of my talk was? Part 2, experiment 2, is the literature that I already knew. I already searched the literature quite a bit. I'm not an open science scientist at all, but I do read up papers regular basis in my free time. And here I'm going to show my favorite papers on open science that I know. I'll discuss them in a bit more detail. And how I did that, I just copy-pasted them from earlier presentations I gave about open science, where I already searched the literature. So this would cost me 0 effort or nearly 0 effort. So one of my favorite papers is this one. It's by Munafo et al. You probably have read this if you search science about open science. You've probably find this paper. It's a manifesto for reproducible research. And they show the research cycle if you do hypothesis-driven research, right? So it's only for that part. And here we see the hypothesis-driven cycle. And we see that there are threats. They called threats to reproducible research. And in the boxes, these are put into numbers. And I must warn you, if you look for this figure online, there exists an incorrect version that inflates these numbers. These numbers are not, these numbers are in the papers if you actually read them. But if you just take this figure from the internet, you'll find the incorrect values, like it's a bit inflated in favor for open science. But these are the real numbers you find in those papers. So for example, problem is a threat to reproducible research is that there's few replication, usually low statistical power, p-value hacking. So that means that you look for significance in many, many attempts until you find something. That's just hunting for some significance. A problem is a publication bias. If you find nothing, if you find no effect, then it's harder to publish. Lack of data sharing, we may already agreed on that. And this is also very prevalent. It's called harking. If you don't know this, it means, I'm going to spell out the abbreviation now, hypothesizing after the results are known. So this means that you have your hypothesis and then you start doing your experiment, you gather your data, and then you think, a different hypothesis would make a better story. And then you put that better story, that more story-friendly hypothesis in your paper as if that's where you started with. That's called harking. That's a threat to reproducible research because the hypothesis was not randomly selected. So these are the threats that this convinced me that yes, there's a problem with regular science. And one of the things I like about open science, one of the best features I think is the honest reporting. So this paper, it shows me about that open science does a cool thing with honest reporting, and it addresses the file drawer problem, that's how it's called, or how you can feel this being held hostage by your data. So imagine you're doing research, regular research, and you find nothing. Then maybe you are disappointed. I think a lot of master students are very disappointed when they find no effect. But this no effect is great. It's great that you find nothing, so please publish it so people don't repeat that. The problem is, if you do it in a traditional literature, only 13% of papers discuss actually finding nothing. They call it a null finding here, so this means finding nothing. Around 1 in 7 papers does that. But if you do a registered report, and I'll tell you what a registered report is first, you get more null findings. So the registered report means that you write down what you're gonna, you write down your introduction and your methods and your analysis, how you're gonna draw your conclusion and your discussion before you have your data. So you write down what you're gonna do and how you're gonna conclude stuff, you publish that, and it will be reviewed. That's a registered report. You get a review before you have the data. And there are journals that if you get through this review, these journals will say, hey, this is good science. You do that experiment, and whatever comes out of this, we publish it. And if you have this liberty that you are encouraged, or there's no consequence of finding nothing, you do this like 5 times more. And I really enjoy that open science allows us to do this honest reporting instead of being scared that you find nothing. Because probably a lot of people have done experiments that we already know find nothing. And open science helps to get rid of that. And I really enjoy that. And this is my third favorite paper. That open science results in better papers, because we read a lot of papers, so it would be great if they would be better. So in this study, they compared registered reports and non-registered reports. So the registered reports, again, is that you publish your experiment before you get the data. And at the right-hand side, the registered reports, so the open science ideas win. They are scored higher. So they ask reviewers to score papers on a lot of aspects. And for example, the methods rigor is significantly way better for registered reports than classic papers. And especially I want to point out the creativity of the methods. So I'm not sure if you ever felt what a registered report is or have done it, but you have to write down everything before. And people feel that they are limited by their creativity in that, because you can't just p-value hack all the way in your research and those kind of things. They feel less creative. They're worried about that creativity. Well, this paper shows that there's no evidence for that. A registered report is considered more creative or equally creative than registered reports. All right, so this, if you ever say people feel that they are afraid of losing their creativeness, this paper argues against that. I won't go through all of them. There are like three of these tables. The analysis rigor is way better. That's my favorite, the top one. And the overall quality of the paper is better. So these are my 3 favorite papers why I think open science is awesome. Third part of my talk. So imagine how you felt about this part of my talk. Like, could you rate it internally? I won't ask you for a rating. Third part of my talk, community.
There's one question. Sorry, I do not know how to yell, but there's one
Yeah,
question.
you yell. Hit me.
Yeah, like this. Okay. How to measure creativity of methods?
Yeah. So what they did is the reviewers were asked to score the creativity of the method. But it's a subjective thing, and I don't know how they did that exactly. That's all I know. I hope that answers your questions. If you want to know more detail, this is the evidence on screen now. Oh, it's Simine Vazier. Yeah. Yep. So it was scored, this creativity. Third part, community. And this part of my talk will be, what are the pros and cons of open science for a researcher today? And how I got these is I just visited the meetings and I selected my favorites. There were more talks, but I think about 5 hours I spent into our community, because it's a young community. And I'll share with you what I've learned there. So the Open Science Uppsala community is in Uppsala. And I'm going to skip this step. Like sometimes I ask like interactive things. I would just wonder if you live in a town with a local community and if you have visited them. And if not, I will encourage you with this talk to do that. And I hope to convince you of it. So Open Science Uppsala, these are our goals. It's on our website. And I just simplify it to verbs. So we teach about open science and we discuss open science. We're also critical about open science. Although we are in Sweden, we use English because we feel this is a more inclusive language. We do this every month. Everyone is welcome if you embrace the scientific method. Well, it's in Uppsala, obviously, so it's local. It's for free, so that means there's no coffee and tea because that would incur costs. Everyone can always walk in. And we are especially in a public place. We're in the public library, not the university, a public library, so everyone can come in. There is no ivory tower there at all. And that's why we are in the public library. And I will go through some of my favorite talks that I've seen there, and I'll show you the papers I've learned there. So my first paper that first presentation was this is my statement. That reading the literature and visiting the community is more interesting or more useful than reading the literature and then reading more literature. And I'll discuss what I found in this community. So one of our talks was by Barbara Bornsater, and she showed me the time and effort it takes to set up an infrastructure. So she worked on heritage data, especially cultural heritage, and she wanted to make the data fair. She wanted to scan objects, for example, and already setting up that infrastructure, she was paid to do that. That's a lot of work. But also on the scientists, like sometimes they take the machines like 3D scanners to the scientists, but sometimes the scientists really had to go to Gotland, which is an island in Sweden, to get their stuff scanned. So this shows the effort that some people are willing to put in. It resulted in a paper, and also these are the references to literature I already mentioned by my literature search that also address this. The second thing I learned at Open Science Uppsala is a talk by Martin Jonsson. And he says that open is not always good. He says open may be unfair to companies, and we should acknowledge that. There was already a paper that also says that. Because a company can be built around a non-shareable resource. Imagine, for example, intellectual property, or for example, like he is in agriculture, imagine a well-bred cow or a well-bred sheep. You're not going to share that well-bred cow or sheep because you want to build your company around it. So open is not always better. What I learned at Open Science Uppsala, this was a talk by Douglas Spangler, and he works on ambulances and predicting how to use ambulances best. And he showed me that if you develop useful open source software, you can avoid bureaucracy, and it helps him to get his software getting used. He just does it, like ambulance data, like how to use your ambulances best. So sometimes he's also on an ambulance. And with his tool, you can better get an idea if to use an ambulance and what kind of car at all. I already knew this on a paper I already read in my literature search. There may be cultural and institutional constraints that you can bypass using open science. That's what he showed me. Anna Hallberg showed me that if you do qualitative research, it's a different thing. So I already talked about a bit like replication and reproducible research. And I feel in these quantitative field, that makes sense for me as a standard, that how reproducibility is very important to me. But she says it doesn't make sense if you do qualitative research. So she works in political science, or worked in political science. And for example, if you have the question, what is democracy? That's a more philosophical question, maybe. Well, how are you going to use reproduction as a measure of quality? That doesn't make sense. And she discussed it. I never realized that. And this is also, I found this in the literature again, but she was the first one to give me that insight. Ismail Uluafik, he showed me that citizen science actually is useful. Because what we do as scientists, we want to try achieve statistical power, so make big cohort studies. But this ignores the individual. That's why we use big cohort studies to get like a significant effect. But with citizen science, and he's leading this for some kind of diabetes, some blood sugar measuring device, there may be some strong effects in a few individuals. And with citizen science, he's helping people to deal with that effect. And they're not excluded from these big studies. They're actually taken care of. Adam Gill, he showed me a very cool technique, and I'll show you, I'll go into details on this one. So this was about doing a pre-registration with maintaining statistical power, and I'll show what this means. So the talk was about peer review, but the most favorite thing about this was called the specification curve analysis. And you can use that as a tool in a pre-registered study. So that means you're going to write down your methods before you get the data to keep your statistical power. This is not mentioned by the earlier literature I've shown you. I didn't find it. I've never knew about this. This is new to my community in Uppsala. And what they did is, so you want to do a pre-registration, all right? And they wanted to do, so the data they used, and it's real data, but the study is a bit funny. Of hurricanes, it's hurricanes in the United States. And a hurricane has a name, and we know the amount of deaths it caused, or they have some measure of the amounts of deaths. And we know some other things like the year and the wind speed and the pressure. That's the data. And the hypothesis they wanted to test, if the name of a hurricane is a predictor of the amounts of deaths. and especially the gender of the name of the hurricane. So let's say you want to pre-register this study. You have they have 1175, I think, ways to test this hypothesis. So more than 1100 ways you can set up your statistics. For example, here at the left, this is a table from that paper. For example, you can decide which storms to analyze. Like you can say, well, I do all of them, or exclude some outliers. You could say, well, how are we going to use how we're going to put the names of the hurricanes into our test. We could say, well, we're going to rate names by femininity, or we're going to say male, female. These are these are like different ways to set up your statistics. Also, how we're going to put the hurricane strength into a number. So they found more than 1100 ways to do it. And you could say, well, then you just do all those tests, and then you do, and that's a problem. And then you do a correction on doing a lot of tests, like a Bonferroni correction or something more advanced. And that's a problem. You don't want to lose your statistical power. So what instead you do, that's the specification curve analysis, is you write down what you're just going to write down your original specifications. You pick one, but then next to this, you do those other tests. And then you compare if the test you picked is an outlier, yes or no. So this, I'll show you the graph here. This is a modified graph from that paper. So the subset, so here they show only 300 of the 728 tests they could come up with. So these are statistical tests. At the y-axis, it's a number of additional deaths predicted from the hurricane name. And this can go up as much as 12. And it can also go to -1. So it can also prevent, like the more feminine name, the more people die. This is mostly for getting male names make people die more often. Each dot on the graph is how many people is predicted to die from that model. And if it's blue, it was not significant. So you would say, well, this has no effect. The big dot is what they specified, which also had no effect. And the black dot is, this was a statistical test that did give a significant result. In that way, you can see if the test you use is like a weird outlier or not. In this case, you can see that would they have found something significant, you would say, well, this is probably just good or bad luck. It has something to do with luck. If it's good or bad, you can decide for yourself. So that's the specification curve analysis. I really enjoy this technique. I think it's a bit brute force, but I learned this at Open Science Uppsala. Now, my favorite talk was this one. This was by Gustav Nilsson, and maybe you already know him. He's working at OSF, the Open Science Foundation, too. This is this international infrastructure for open science. And he's mostly considered by badges. So he feels that there should be status badges. For example, if your science is reproducible, there should be a badge. If you have done anything, and if you're a peer reviewer, you should get a badge to make it more visual what we do, except than just paper output. And he showed me a paper in his talk. So we didn't have fancy flyers back then. So this is just a picture of the dude. He showed that even if data is open, different teams can draw opposite conclusions with high confidence. And this will make interpreting the results even harder. And only open science can do this. I'll show you. So this was the experiment he quoted. So here we see a lot of brains, and brains have activity. They measured activity. And these brains were subjected to, or the people with that brains, they were subjected to 2 treatments, A and B. I don't know exactly what the treatment was. That's also irrelevant. They gave around 40 different teams the same set of 9 hypotheses. And each hypothesis was like, there is an effect, like an increase or decrease in a brain area between treatments A and B. So very simple hypotheses, and all research teams got the same data. So you would expect that different research teams all agree if hypothesis is true or false because they get the same data. This is complete nonsense. So here we see, I cut up the figure here. So the research team, they got these 9 hypotheses, and at the y-axis we see what each team thought about each hypothesis, if it's true or false. So it's a bit anonymized here. So the team has an ID and not like the full name or the professor name there. And what we see is that, and if it's green, it means that that team for that hypothesis thought the hypothesis is true. And if it's red, that team for that hypothesis thinks it's false. All right, so you see, this is not at all what you would expect. These teams, they disagree if it's true or false based on the same data and the same hypothesis. And what's even worse is that they are super confident in this. So these numbers, they mean the confidence they had in that statement. So for hypothesis number 2, the second team says it's false with the highest confidence possible. Whereas the fourth team says it's true with the highest possible confidence. So I think only open science can do this. If we allow people to reproduce research, then science is indeed more complex, and only open science can show this. So this is one of my favorite papers, why we should do open science.
Excuse me.
Yes, hit me.
Richèl, it was purely a descriptive paper. They did not offer any explanation as to why there were so strong differences in.
I didn't read that part. I don't know. So if you want to read that on, so this is the reference.
Yeah.
I'm mostly interested in showing this result here.
I think I can jump in if you want. I know the paper quite well, and basically
right, yeah.
in neuroimaging you have a lot of degrees of freedom when it comes to analyzing your data. You can choose different software packages, different ways of processing images, different things you control for, like age or sex, and there's so many variables. And in this paper they let all the researchers choose their own way of processing data, so that's where the variability comes from as well. Not just the final stats test, but everything that comes before.
Okay,
yeah, like there's this paper about the 38 degrees of freedom we have in our research by these Dutch people. I don't remember that reference by heart. But Ilona, so it's mostly methodological. Or was there also personality involved, Ilona? Do you know about that? Or is it purely, like, is there more than just methods?
You mean personality of the researcher?
Yeah, like
No.
I don't know, maybe. Like, is it purely methodological, or are there more things that were not accounted for, even if you do that? I don't know. All right.
I don't think so, but I think it's mostly methods, like the way people chose to interpret the question and how they would approach it statistically.
It's very interesting from I would be interested in having the link to the paper if you can pass it in the chat, because it's a nice illustration of a philosophical concept in the philosophy of science of the underdetermination of theory by evidence, and especially all the differences you're talking about. We would categorize them as background assumptions, so as they are called. And so according to your background assumptions, you can draw the different conclusions with the same data. But it seems to be a very nice case study. So if you,
I think so too. So the reference is on screen. I can't copy paste because it's not a PowerPoint here what I show.
But I don't know how to copy paste it either. So I can send you an email.
Yeah, that will
later.
work.
Thank you.
That will work. Yep. So thanks, Ilona, for this insight. So it was all more methodological, also like the hurricane paper, right? There was also like methodological differences there. So I really think that this shows how complex science is, even more complex maybe than we're ready for. And I think open science at least allows us to observe that. So one thing, so I've spoken about regular literature, I've spoken about searching the literature even more, and I've discussed open science Uppsala community. There's another community, which is what we are part of now. So this was, for example, like last time we had this figure. This was a poll about, I think 612 people took part of this. And I think what is very interesting, so where do you see the main 3 obstacles in open science? And what I enjoy seeing here is that for these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things, at the bottom, only the missing infrastructure is discussed at my local community in Uppsala. The bottom 5, I found evidence to the literature for, but the top one, although it's the most prevalent, I could not pinpoint exactly like where does this come from, how does this meet the literature, how would we discuss that? So I would love to see more, to know more about this. What exactly is meant by missing information institutional report, because it's obviously the biggest obstacle here. So this is, I hope that Pia Voigt, I think she did this research. I would love to know more about this in, for example, a future meeting, or maybe here in the discussion already. I'm going to round off. So my goal was to convince you that reading the literature and visiting in the community is way more interesting than reading the literature and reading more literature. Because I think that the first part where I did the literature search was the dullest part of my presentation, but you can disagree with that. I think the part about the community is way more fun and interesting, and I could not have found those things by searching more literature. So if we agree that the community part was more fun than my literature search about the cons of open science, you could agree mathematically that my statement is correct. And I think this is mostly because the people that you meet in the community have way broader ideas than you search literature for. And ENLIGHT is a community too. So I will encourage you, because this is my last slide, to discuss, criticize open science, share your reference with me. I love that. Criticize my publication, please do that. Or say, well, yeah, there are also good things I guess we can praise. But that was my talk. Again, you can download it here, but also Merle will put it everywhere possible. Are there any questions?